The moment a man in a $10,000 suit looked at a grieving grandmother and said, "That is not my problem. I knew this case was going to change someone's life, and I intended to make sure it changed his." If stories like this one speak to you, consider following this channel so you never miss another courtroom lesson worth remembering. Before I go any further, I want to be clear about something important. This is a dramatized story inspired by courtroom lessons. The names, places, and situations you are about to hear are entirely fictional. This is not a real case, not a real court record, and the characters are not real people. The purpose of this story is to explore the principles of law, accountability, and compassion in a way that anyone can understand and learn from. Now, let me tell you about the case. I have sat on the bench at Millbrook County Courthouse for more than 20 years. In that time, I have seen many different kinds of people walk through those courtroom doors, the nervous ones, the broken ones, the angry ones, and every now and then, the ones who walk in as though the rules of this world simply do not apply to them. Those are the cases that stay with me the longest. Before I tell you about the case that brought a packed courtroom to complete silence not once but twice, I want to share a smaller memory. Years ago, a landlord appeared before me in a routine eviction hearing. The tenant, an older man who had lived in the same apartment for 11 years, had fallen behind on rent because of a hospital stay. The landlord wanted him gone immediately. He had every technical legal right to pursue the eviction, but when I reviewed the documents, I noticed the landlord had failed to follow the proper notice procedure required by law. Technically, the eviction could not proceed. The landlord was furious. He argued that the outcome was unfair. I told him calmly that the law exists precisely to protect people from decisions made in haste or anger, and that those protections apply equally to everyone. That tenant got additional time. He eventually caught up on his payments and remained in that apartment for 3 more years. I think about that case often because it taught me that small details in legal documents are not small at all. They are the difference between justice and its opposite. That lesson came back to me the moment the case of Holt versus the Delgado family landed on my docket. If this kind of legal story resonates with you, drop a comment below and let me know what lesson you would most want to see explored next. The defendant was a man named Marcus Holt. He was the owner and chief executive of Holt Premier Developments, a real estate company that had spent the last several years purchasing older residential buildings across Millbrook County and converting them into high-end luxury units. On paper, there was nothing illegal about that kind of business. People invest in real estate every day. But the way Marcus Holt operated was a different matter entirely. The plaintiffs were the Delgado family. Rosa Delgado was 53 years old. She had lived in apartment 4B at the Cedarwood Terrace complex for 16 years. She was a home care aide who worked long hours to support her 2 adult children, her teenage granddaughter named Lily, and her elderly father, Eduardo, who had limited mobility and depended heavily on the stability of their home. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were simply a family who had built their life in one place, quietly and honestly, for a very long time. 8 months before the case reached my courtroom, Marcus Holt's company purchased the Cedarwood Terrace complex. Within 2 months of that purchase, every tenant in the building received a notice. The notice stated that their leases were being terminated due to planned renovations and that they had 60 days to vacate. Rosa Delgado received her notice on a Tuesday afternoon and described feeling the floor disappear beneath her feet. She had a lease, a written lease, one that still had 14 months remaining on it, and she was being told to leave in 60 days. Stay with me through this story because what I discovered in that courtroom is something I still think about today. When Rosa could not find an attorney willing to take her case quickly, she came to court herself. She brought a folder. Inside that folder were documents she had carefully kept for 16 years. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a blue cardigan, her hands folded neatly on top of that folder, and she looked at me with eyes that were tired but steady. Her granddaughter Lily sat just behind her in the gallery, quietly holding her great-grandfather Eduardo's hand. Marcus Holt arrived with 2 attorneys and a legal assistant carrying a briefcase. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit. He did not look at Rosa Delgado when he entered. He did not acknowledge her presence at all. He spoke in low, confident tones to his lawyers, occasionally glancing around the courtroom with the kind of expression that suggested he considered this entire proceeding a minor inconvenience. His lead attorney opened by stating that the eviction was straightforward and lawful. He argued that when Holt Premier Developments purchased Cedarwood Terrace, the original lease agreements between tenants and the previous owner were superseded by the terms of sale. He presented a clause in the purchase agreement that he claimed gave the new owner the right to issue termination notices to all current tenants with 60 days of notice. It sounded neat. It sounded prepared. And I could tell from the way Holt's attorney delivered those words that he expected this case to end quickly. But I was already looking at something else. I had been reviewing the evidence submitted to the court before the hearing. Rosa's folder contained her original lease agreement, signed 16 years ago with the previous owner of Cedarwood Terrace, a man named George Aldridge. The lease had been renewed several times, but the most recent renewal, signed just over 2 years ago, contained a clause, a very specific clause. It stated in plain language that in the event of a property sale, the tenant's current lease agreement would remain fully valid and enforceable for its entire remaining term, and that no new owner could unilaterally terminate the lease before its natural expiration without cause related to non-payment or violation of terms. That clause was unusual. It was the kind of protective language that a careful landlord sometimes includes when they want long-term tenants to feel secure. George Aldridge had clearly cared about his tenants. But here is what troubled me even more than the clause itself. When I looked at the copy of Rosa's lease that Marcus Holt's legal team had submitted to the court as their own evidence, that clause was missing. The document they submitted was 2 pages long. Rosa's original document was 3 pages long. Page 2 of the version submitted by Holt's team ended in the middle of a paragraph. Page 3, the page containing the protective clause, was simply gone. The entire courtroom drama that followed began the moment I asked Holt's attorney to approach the bench. I asked him calmly and without accusation whether the document submitted as evidence was a complete copy of the original lease agreement. He paused. He looked at the document. He said yes, it appeared to be complete. I then asked Rosa to bring her original to the front. I placed both versions side by side on my bench. The courtroom fell completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. You could hear someone in the gallery shift in their seat. Every eye in that room watched as I compared those 2 documents. I then asked Holt's attorney to explain to me why the document submitted by his client was missing an entire page that existed in the tenant's original copy, a copy that bore the same signature date, the same notary stamp, and the same initials on every page, including the 3rd one. He had no immediate answer. He asked for a brief recess. I granted 10 minutes. When we returned, the atmosphere in that courtroom had changed completely. Holt's calm, confident expression was gone. He was leaning close to his attorneys, speaking quickly, his jaw tight. Rosa Delgado sat exactly as she had before, hands folded, eyes steady. If you've made it this far in the story, I want to ask you to share this video with someone who needs to hear that the law can still protect the people who have the least power. During the recess, my clerk also brought me something that had arrived minutes earlier. Earlier in the week, I had quietly requested that the court's records office pull any other eviction filings associated with Holt Premier Developments from the past 3 years. What came back was a document that I read 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. In the past 32 months, Holt Premier Developments had filed eviction proceedings against 41 tenants across 7 different properties in Millbrook County. Of those 41 cases, 37 had been settled quickly, most with the tenant simply vacating because they did not know they had the right to fight back. Of the 4 that reached a courtroom, 3 had been decided in Holt's favor. Only 1 had ever been challenged with the kind of thorough document review I was conducting now. This was not a single mistake. This was a pattern. And then something happened that I did not expect. One of Holt's own attorneys, a younger man named James Riley, who had been quiet throughout the entire morning, asked if he could speak privately with the court. He looked pale. He said to me in a voice just above a whisper that he had joined the firm only 4 months ago and that he had not been the one to prepare the eviction documents in this case. He said he was not prepared to continue arguing on behalf of a submission he now had reason to believe was incomplete in a way that was not accidental. The second silence fell over that courtroom like a curtain. Marcus Holt stared at his own attorney with an expression I can only describe as betrayal mixed with fury. James Riley did not look back at him. He looked at me, and I believed him. I thanked him for his honesty and noted it for the record. I then addressed Marcus Holt directly, calmly, and clearly. I told him that what had been placed before this court was a serious matter. Submitting an incomplete document as evidence, particularly when the missing section contained language that directly undermined the legal basis for the eviction, is not a clerical error. It is the kind of action that the law treats very seriously. I told him I intended to review every aspect of this case thoroughly before delivering any verdict, and that the scope of my review would now extend beyond Rosa Delgado's situation alone. This is where the story reaches the part that I believe matters most. Now, let me take you through my thinking as I prepared for the verdict, because I want you to understand exactly how I weighed what was in front of me. The law was clear on one thing. Rosa Delgado's lease contained a valid protective clause. That clause was enforceable. Marcus Holt's company did not have the legal right to terminate her tenancy before the lease expired, regardless of what the purchase agreement between Holt and the previous owner said. Two parties cannot make a private agreement that strips a third party of rights they already legally hold. That is a foundational principle of contract law, and it applies here without question. On the matter of accountability, the incomplete document submitted to my court was something I could not ignore. I referred the matter to the County Bar Association for review of the attorneys involved in preparing that submission. I also formally flagged the pattern of eviction filings to the County Housing Authority and requested a full audit of all 41 cases associated with Holt Premier Developments. That process would take time, but it needed to begin. On the matter of compassion, I looked at Rosa Delgado. I looked at Lily sitting quietly in the gallery. I looked at Eduardo, who had not fully understood everything that had happened that day, but who had held on to his granddaughter's hand the entire time. These were people whose stability, health, and dignity were directly at stake. Compassion does not mean ignoring the law. It means making sure the law is applied in a way that recognizes the human reality behind every case file. And on the matter of protecting the community, the pattern I had uncovered told me that without intervention, other families in Millbrook County would face the same situation. Many of them already had. Some of them had left their homes not knowing they could have stayed. I delivered the verdict. I ruled that the eviction of Rosa Delgado and her family from apartment 4B at the Cedarwood Terrace complex was unlawful. Her lease was valid, enforceable, and not subject to termination by Holt Premier Developments under its remaining term. I ordered that she and her family be allowed to remain in their home for the full duration of that lease without interference, penalty, or harassment. I further ordered that Holt Premier Developments pay the Delgado family's legal filing costs and any documented expenses they had incurred as a result of the unlawful eviction proceedings, including the cost of temporary storage for belongings they had already begun packing. I also issued a formal notice to Holt Premier Developments that any further eviction proceedings in Millbrook County would be subject to heightened judicial review pending the outcome of the Housing Authority audit. Marcus Holt did not speak when I finished. He sat very still. The composure he had carried into that courtroom in the morning was completely gone. He looked for the first time like someone who understood that the world he thought he controlled had just reminded him that it did not, in fact, belong only to him. Rosa Delgado pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Then she straightened, turned to look at Lily, and nodded. Lily leaned forward and wrapped her arms around her grandmother from behind. Eduardo patted Rosa's arms slowly, not fully sure what had been decided, but sensing from the room that something had gone right. James Riley, the young attorney who had spoken honestly at a moment when it would have been easier to stay quiet, gathered his papers and left the courtroom without looking at his former client. If you found value in this legal story, I hope you will follow this channel and stay with us for every verdict still to come. I sat at that bench for a few minutes after the room had begun to clear. I often do that. It helps me process the weight of what just happened. What I kept thinking about was the folder. Rosa Delgado had walked into that courtroom carrying 16 years of her life in a simple folder. She had kept every document, every renewal, every signature, because somewhere in her understanding of the world, she believed that doing things the right way still mattered, that those papers meant something, that honesty had value even when no one in power seemed to be paying attention. She was right. This courtroom drama was not, at its heart, about a lease or a missing page or even a real estate company. It was about what happens when someone in power assumes that people without resources have no recourse. The law exists precisely to correct that assumption. And when it works the way it is meant to work, it reminds all of us that fairness is not reserved for those who can afford the most expensive lawyers. Justice served that day was not about punishing one man. It was about restoring what had been taken, preventing further harm, and sending a clear message that accountability is not optional based on how much money you have in the bank. I think about Rosa Delgado when I encounter people who have given up on the idea that the system can work for them. I think about how she walked in quietly, with steady eyes and a folder of papers, and trusted that honesty would be enough. And I think about the fact that on that day, in that courtroom, it was. The law is not perfect. No system built by human beings ever is. But when the people inside it, the attorneys, the witnesses, even those who realize mid-proceeding that they have been on the wrong side, choose honesty over comfort, the law becomes something worth believing in again. Carry that thought with you today. Think about the systems in your own life where someone with less power is trusting that fairness will show up for them, sometimes being the person who speaks honestly, who keeps the right documents, or who simply refuses to walk away without being heard, is exactly what justice needs in order to do its job. Thank you for sitting with me in this courtroom today. I hope this legal story reminded you that the law is most powerful, not when it punishes loudly, but when it protects quietly. Until next time.